Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back. Tonight, we step into the golden drawing rooms of Mayfair, where chandeliers glitter, champagne flows, and beneath the silken pearls, something far more dangerous waits to be uncovered. A young heiress lies dead in her townhouse, a jeweled cobra necklace coiled around her throat like a lover's last embrace. The doctors say the mark on her neck came from the serpent's fangs. A tragic accident, they whisper, a cursed piece of jewelry from the East. But one man does not believe in curses. One man believes only in facts, in little grey cells, in the quiet, patient unravelling of a lie. Hercule Poirot has arrived in Mayfair, and he already knows the snake did not kill her. Before we begin, if stories like this, elegant, puzzling, and full of secrets behind polished doors, are the kind of evenings you love, do stay a while and settle in. It means more to me than you know. Now, let us begin. The Serpent's Gift. The fog had settled over Mayfair like a grey shawl thrown carelessly across the shoulders of the city. And it was through this fog that Hercule Poirot's taxi crawled its way toward Carrington Square shortly before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in November. He had received the telephone call only an hour earlier. Chief Inspector Japp, sounding rather more clipped than usual, had said only, "Poirot, you had better come. It's Mayfair. It's ugly, and it's odd, and I don't like odd." Poirot did not consider himself a man who was often surprised, but as he stepped out of the taxi and looked up at the elegant white-fronted townhouse before him, its black railings gleaming faintly with the night's rain, its window boxes still holding the last stubborn chrysanthemums of autumn, he felt the small, familiar stirring in his mind that told him something here was not as it appeared. A constable at the door recognized him at once and lifted the tape without a word. Inside, the hallway smelled of beeswax polish and, faintly, of something sweeter, a perfume perhaps, or flowers left too long in their vase. Japp was waiting for him at the foot of the staircase, his hat still on, his face the particular shade of grim that Poirot had come to associate with cases the inspector did not care for. "Upstairs," Japp said. "Second floor." Her name was Miss Evelyn Rossiter, 26 years old. Heiress to the Rossiter shipping fortune. You'll have heard the name. "I have heard the name," Poirot agreed, climbing the stairs with his usual unhurried precision. One does not spend 30 years in London without hearing the name Rossiter. "Tell me, mon ami, how did she die?" "That," said Japp, pausing outside a door of pale blue, "is exactly the trouble." The bedroom was large and beautifully appointed, pale blue silk on the walls, a dressing table crowded with crystal bottles, a fire long since burned to ash in the grate. Miss Evelyn Rossiter lay upon a chaise longue near the window, as though she had simply lain down to rest and never risen again. She was still in her evening gown of ivory satin, and around her throat, coiled twice, was a necklace the like of which Poirot had rarely seen. A serpent wrought in gold, its scales picked out in tiny emeralds, its head raised with two small rubies for eyes, and where its fangs should have been, two slender points of gold that caught the grey morning light. "The Cobra of Mayfair, they're calling it already," Japp said with distaste. "Some fool at the Yard let it slip to a reporter before I'd even finished my tea. Now look at her neck." Poirot bent low, his eyes narrowing at the two small puncture marks visible just above the necklace's coils, dark and slightly swollen against the pale skin of her throat. "The doctor says it looks precisely like a snake bite," Japp went on. "Two punctures, right depth, right spacing, and there's no other mark on her, no bruising round the throat, no sign of a struggle. He's half convinced himself the wretched thing is cursed." "Ah," said Poirot softly, straightening. He touched neither the body nor the necklace, but stood for a long moment simply looking, his hands folded behind his back, his head tilted very slightly, like a man listening for a sound just beyond the edge of hearing. "And you, Chief Inspector, are you also half convinced?" Japp snorted. "I've been half convinced of a great many impossible things in my time, Poirot. And every one of them turned out to have a very possible explanation once you'd finished poking about. That's why I called you. Poirot allowed himself the smallest of smiles, though his eyes remained fixed on the necklace's golden fangs. Then let us begin with the poking about, as you so elegantly put it. Tell me, who found her, and who, in this house, had reason to give Mademoiselle Rossiter a gift so beautiful and so very deadly? He crouched, a movement that cost him this morning a small grunt he did not trouble to disguise, for his knees were no longer the knees of a young man, and studied the necklace's fangs more closely without touching them. They are hollow, he murmured, half to himself, or I am very much mistaken. Hollow? Japp frowned. What, like a real snake's fangs? Précisément, mon ami. Poirot rose slowly, one hand pressed briefly to the small of his back. Which means, Chief Inspector, that our serpent required someone to fill it. And that person, whoever they are, is not a curse. They are a murderer with excellent taste in jewelry, and I intend to find them before luncheon. Hollow fangs. Dr. Wilfred Marsh, the police surgeon, was a thin, precise man with spectacles that seemed perpetually in danger of sliding from his nose, and he greeted Poirot's arrival with the weary resignation of a man who had already argued this case twice that morning and expected to argue it a third time. I know what you're going to say, Marsh said, before Poirot had said anything at all. You're going to tell me it wasn't a snake. I would not dream of contradicting a man of science until I have seen his evidence, Poirot said mildly. Show me. Marsh knelt beside the chaise longue and, with a pair of fine forceps, gently drew back the golden coils of the necklace from the dead woman's throat. The two puncture marks stood out clearly now, dark red against skin that had already begun to take on the faint grey pallor of death. 2 punctures, 1¼ inches apart, Marsh said. Consistent with a large snake. A cobra, certainly, or something of similar size. Slight swelling, some discoloration beginning around the wound, which you'd expect with venom. Frankly, Monsieur Poirot, if I hadn't been told this necklace was sitting in a locked cabinet 3 floors below at midnight, I'd have signed the certificate and gone home to my breakfast. And can you tell me, said Poirot, at what hour she died? Between 11 and 1, best guess. Rigors consistent with that. I'll know more once I've got her on the table. Poirot studied the wound a moment longer, his moustache twitching very slightly as he thought. Tell me, Doctor, is it possible for a wound such as this to be made not by fangs, but by something fashioned to resemble fangs? 2 fine points, sharp enough to pierce the skin? Marsh looked up at him properly for the first time. It's possible, he admitted slowly. I'd need to examine the necklace itself to say for certain. Fang marks have a particular character. A tearing, sometimes, if the creature moves. These are very clean, very precise. Too precise, perhaps, for an animal in the act of striking, Poirot murmured. An animal does not measure 1¼ inches, Doctor. A man with a piece of jewelry in his hand might. He turned from the body and crossed to the dressing table, where a maid's uniform, grey with a small white collar, stood pressed and waiting on a hanger by the wardrobe, evidently laid out the night before for the morning that never came. Chief Inspector, Poirot called. Who discovered the body? Japp, who had been standing by the door in quiet conversation with a constable, came forward. Her maid, a girl named Susan Fenwick, found her at 7:30 when she came up with the morning tea. Then I should very much like to speak with Susan Fenwick, said Poirot. But first, the necklace. Who gave it to her? A gift, was it not? And recently? According to the housekeeper, it arrived 3 days ago, Japp said, consulting his notebook. No card. Delivered by messenger to the front door, addressed to Miss Rossiter personally. No card, Poirot repeated softly, and something in his eyes sharpened. A gift so magnificent, and the giver wished to remain anonymous. That is interesting, Chief Inspector. That is very interesting indeed. They found Susan Fenwick in the small sitting room below stairs, seated stiffly on the edge of a hard chair, with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, untouched. She was perhaps 19, red-eyed from weeping, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap with the particular restlessness of someone who does not know what to do with grief when it arrives too suddenly to be understood. Poirot seated himself opposite her, and for a moment said nothing at all, merely regarded her with an expression of such gentle sympathy that the girl's shoulders, which had been rigid with the effort of composure, sagged slightly. "Mademoiselle Fenwick," he said at last, "I am sorry to trouble you on such a morning, but I think you loved your mistress, and I think you wish, as I do, to see justice done for her. Is that not so?" "Yes, sir," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was kind to me, sir." "Not all of them are, in these big houses, but Miss Evelyn always asked after my mother, and at Christmas she—" The girl stopped, pressing the handkerchief to her mouth. "Take your time," Poirot said kindly. "There is no hurry. Tell me only what you remember. When did you last see her alive?" "10:30, sir, or thereabouts. I helped her dress for the evening. She was going to a small supper party, just a few friends," she said. "Nothing grand. She wore the ivory gown." Susan's eyes went, unwillingly, toward the ceiling, as though she could see through it to the room above. "And then this morning I brought her tea, same as always, and she was just lying there, sir, so still, and I thought at first she was only sleeping late, and then I saw the necklace, and her poor neck, and I—" "You did not see her put on the necklace last night?" "No, sir. She wasn't wearing it when I left her." "I'd have remembered. It's not the sort of thing you'd forget, is it, a thing like that?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Then someone placed it upon her after you left, mademoiselle. At the supper party, perhaps, or after she returned home." "I couldn't say, sir. I was abed by 11. "I always am." "And who else sleeps in this house? The other staff?" "There's cook, and Mr. Hargreaves the butler, and Mary who does the rough work, and myself. We're all above the kitchen, sir, quite separate from the family rooms." "And the family? Who else lives under this roof?" Susan hesitated, and for the first time something flickered across her face that was not grief, but a more complicated thing. Caution, perhaps, or loyalty struggling against instinct. "There's Mr. Gerald, sir, Miss Evelyn's cousin. And Miss Evelyn was engaged to be married, sir, to Mr. Charles Wembley, though he doesn't live here, of course. He only visits." "And Madame Rossiter, Miss Evelyn's aunt by marriage, who has the rooms on the first floor." "I see." Poirot's voice remained perfectly light, perfectly unhurried, but Hastings, had he been present, would have recognized the particular stillness that came over his friend when a thread had, at last, been found. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Fenwick, was Mr. Gerald at home last night?" "I believe so, sir. I heard him come in around midnight. I couldn't sleep, you see, on account of the wind rattling the shutters, and I heard the front door." "Midnight," Poirot repeated softly. "And the supper party? At what hour did Miss Evelyn return from it?" "I don't rightly know, sir. I was asleep by then myself." Poirot rose, smoothing his waistcoat with two small, precise movements, and permitted himself a slight bow toward the weeping girl. "You have been most helpful, mademoiselle. Most helpful indeed. One more thing only, and then I shall trouble you no further. Did Miss Evelyn ever speak of receiving gifts from an admirer she did not name? A secret suitor, perhaps?" Susan's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward the door as though to be certain it was closed. "There was something, sir, just last week. She had a letter that made her go quite pale, and when I asked if anything was wrong, she said only, 'Someone remembers me, Susan, after all these years,' and wouldn't say another word about it." Poirot's eyebrows rose, very slightly, and he exchanged a glance with Japp, who had been listening from the doorway with his notebook forgotten in his hand. "After all these years," Poirot repeated, half to himself. "Now that, Chief Inspector, is a phrase that interests me very much. A gift from a stranger is one mystery. A gift from someone who remembers, that, mon ami, is quite another." Faces in Mayfair. Gerald Rossiter received Poirot in the library, a room of dark oak panelling and tall windows through which the November light fell thin and grey across shelves of unread books. He was a young man of perhaps 30, dressed with the careless elegance of someone who had never had to think about the cost of his tailor, and he poured himself a whisky before he had properly said good morning, though it was not yet 10 o'clock. "Beastly business," he said, dropping into a leather armchair without offering Poirot one. "Poor Evelyn. Can't quite believe it, if I'm honest with you. You were close to your cousin, Monsieur Rossiter. Close enough. Grew up together, more or less. My father and her father were brothers, you understand, and after both of them died, I came to live here. Evelyn's always been decent to me." He took a long swallow of the whisky. "Better than decent. Kept me on an allowance out of her own pocket, if you want the truth of it, and I dare say half of London knew it." Poirot's eyes moved, briefly, and without appearing to move at all, around the room. The good but slightly worn furnishings, the empty spaces on the shelves where, perhaps, valuable books had once stood, and did so no longer. "An allowance," Poirot said gently. "That is generous of her. And this allowance, does it continue now that she is gone?" Gerald's face changed, very slightly. Not guilt, precisely, but the particular wariness of a man who has heard a question he has already asked himself and does not like the answer. "I suppose that depends on the will," he said. "I haven't the least idea what's in it. You'll have to ask her solicitor that, not me." "Of course. Forgive me. It is only that I must ask everyone the same tiresome questions, you understand, so that no one may feel singled out. Tell me instead of last night. You returned home at midnight, I am told. Roundabout? Yes. I'd been at my club. Boodles, you can check with the porter. He'll remember me. I lost rather a lot of money at cards, and made something of a scene about it, I'm sorry to say." "And Miss Evelyn, did you see her when you returned?" "No. House was dark. I assumed she was still out or already abed." Gerald finished the whisky and set the glass down with a small, decisive click. "I say, you don't think I had anything to do with this? I loved Evelyn. Whatever else you hear about me, and you'll hear plenty, I don't doubt, this is Mayfair. Everyone talks. I loved my cousin." "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that grief and love are not always proof against other considerations, monsieur. But I have formed no conclusions. I have barely begun." Charles Wembley, Evelyn Rossiter's fiancé, was a different sort of man altogether. Tall, fair, with the sort of open, handsome face that seemed built for reassurance, and eyes that were red-rimmed with what appeared, at least to Poirot's practised eye, to be genuine grief. He had arrived at the house within the hour of hearing the news, and had not, according to Hargreaves the butler, left the drawing-room since, save to be sick once in the cloakroom. "I don't understand it," Wembley said, over and over, in the manner of a man whose mind has simply refused to accept new information. "I saw her only last night. We were at supper together, Lady Ashworth's, just a small party, 8 of us. She was happy, Monsieur Poirot. She was laughing. How can a woman be laughing at midnight and dead by 1 o'clock? You were at the supper party together. At what hour did you part from her?" "I saw her into her car outside Lady Ashworth's house. 11:30, perhaps a little after. I offered to see her home myself, but she said there was no need. Her driver was waiting." He pressed a hand briefly over his eyes. "I wish to God I had insisted." "Was there anything unusual about her manner that evening? Anything that struck you as different?" Wembley hesitated. A hesitation Poirot noted with the small, silent attention of a man filing away a fact for later use. "There was one thing," Wembley admitted slowly. "She received a note during supper. A footman brought it in on a little tray, the way one does, and she read it and went rather quiet for a few minutes. When I asked if anything was wrong, she said it was nothing, an old friend playing games with her, and changed the subject. I didn't think much of it at the time." "Do you know what became of this note?" "I've no idea. She may have kept it, or thrown it in the fire, or I really couldn't say. One more question, monsieur, and I ask it only because I must ask it of everyone. The engagement between yourself and Miss Rossiter, it was, I understand, of some months' standing." 6 months, Wembley said. We were to be married in the spring. And the marriage settlement. Forgive me. These are ugly questions to ask a grieving man. But murder, monsieur, is an uglier business still. And I find that money walks very close beside it, more often than not. Was there a settlement arranged? Wembley's jaw tightened, but he answered steadily enough. There was. Evelyn was generous. She wished to settle a sum on me regardless, so that no one could say I married her for her fortune. I refused it, for what that's worth. I have my own income, Monsieur Poirot. I did not need hers, and I did not want it. Poirot inclined his head slightly, neither believing nor disbelieving, merely recording. Thank you, monsieur. You have been most patient with an old man's questions. Madame Rossiter, Evelyn's aunt by marriage, a widow of some 60 years with iron-grey hair drawn back severely from a face that had once, Poirot thought, been rather beautiful and had not entirely forgotten how to look it, received him in her own sitting-room on the first floor, a chamber crowded with photographs in silver frames and the particular chill of a fire lit too late in the morning. I suppose you must do your duty, Monsieur Poirot, she said, before he had properly seated himself, though I confess I find the whole business distasteful. Evelyn is dead. Poking about in the ashes of her private affairs will not bring her back. No, madame, Poirot agreed. But it may bring her justice, which is, I think, the only gift left that we can give her now. The old woman's mouth tightened, but she said nothing in reply to that. You have lived in this house how long, madame? 15 years. Since my husband died. Evelyn's father, my brother-in-law, was kind enough to give me rooms here, and Evelyn continued the arrangement after his death. I have no complaints to make of her. She was a good girl, whatever her faults. Her faults? Something flickered behind the old woman's eyes, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough. I did not mean to imply anything unkind. All young women have faults, monsieur. Evelyn was headstrong. She did not always listen to those who knew better than she did. Concerning what, madame? Did she not listen? Concerning her choice of friends. Concerning that necklace, if you must know. The old woman's hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. I told her, the moment it arrived, that a gift with no card, no name, no explanation, was not a gift to be worn, but a gift to be returned. Or better still, burned. She laughed at me. She said I was superstitious. And now look, you knew then that the necklace was significant, that it meant something beyond its beauty. Madame Rossiter's eyes met his, steady and cold. I knew that Evelyn's mother, my brother-in-law's first wife, dead these 30 years, was fond of Indian jewelry, snakes in particular. She had a whole collection of the wretched things. I always thought it a morbid taste. When that necklace arrived, I wondered whether someone was trying to remind Evelyn of her mother, or whether someone was trying to remind her of something else entirely. I did not ask what. I am too old, Monsieur Poirot, to go digging in graves that were dug 30 years before I ever set foot in this house. Poirot sat very still for a moment, his sharp eyes fixed on the old woman's face. 30 years, he said softly. Someone remembers me. After all these years. Madame, I think you have just given me something rather more valuable than you intended. 30 years of silence. Poirot did not go directly to his lodgings that afternoon, though his knees, he admitted privately, would have been grateful for the rest. Instead, he directed his taxi to Somerset House, where a young clerk with ink-stained fingers spent the better part of an hour producing, at his request, the record of the late Mrs. Rossiter, Evelyn's mother, dead these 30 years, and the record, harder won, of her death. Margaret Rossiter, the clerk read aloud, running a finger down the yellowed page, died the 14th of March, 1926. Cause of death, he paused, frowning slightly at the entry. Well, that's an odd one. It says here, misadventure, Monsieur Poirot, snakebite. There's a note referring to an inquest. Poirot's hand, resting on the edge of the clerk's desk, went very still. A snake bite, he repeated softly. In England, in the year 1926. Tell me, mon jeune ami, where does an Englishwoman encounter a snake in the county of Surrey? Doesn't say, sir, only that the inquest returned a verdict of misadventure, death by snakebite, unlawful killing not established. There's a reference number here for the coroner's file, if you want the full record. Kept at the county archive, though, not here. Poirot copied the reference number into his notebook with great care, and for a long moment sat quite still, his moustache trembling very slightly with the effort of a mind working at great speed behind an outwardly placid face. 30 years, he murmured. The mother dies of a snake bite that has no business occurring in Surrey. 30 years later, the daughter dies in precisely the same manner, wearing a necklace fashioned in the shape of the very creature that is supposed to have killed her mother. Chief Inspector Japp will tell me this is coincidence. I do not believe in coincidence, mon ami. I believe in someone with a very long memory and a very patient hatred. He found Japp that evening at the yard, coat off, sleeves rolled, working through a stack of statements with the particular weariness of a man who has interviewed too many people and learned too little. Snakebite, Japp said, when Poirot had finished. The mother too? Good God! Why did nobody flag that at the time? Because, mon ami, in 1926, no one thought to connect an old woman's tragic accident with anything at all. Accidents happen. It is only when the same accident happens twice, 30 years apart, to mother and daughter both, that a reasonable man begins to suspect it is not an accident in the least. You think someone's been planning this for 30 years. I think, Poirot said carefully, that someone has been waiting 30 years for an opportunity, which is not quite the same thing. Revenge, mon ami, is a dish some men are content to let go cold, and colder still, until the day arrives when it may finally be served. Tell me, who benefits from Miss Evelyn's death? Who inherits the Rossiter fortune? Japp consulted his notes. Solicitor came in this afternoon, actually. Chap named Pemberton. The will's straightforward enough on its face. Everything to Gerald Rossiter, the cousin, with a smaller sum settled on the aunt, Madame Rossiter, and a personal bequest to the maid, Susan Fenwick of all people. £500. Nice little sum for a girl in her position. And Monsieur Wembley, the fiancé, he inherits nothing. Not a penny. Which rather argues against him wanting her dead, wouldn't you say? Man doesn't usually murder his fiancée for the privilege of getting nothing. Unless, Poirot said slowly, he did not know he would get nothing. Or unless, mon ami, his motive was never money at all. He tapped a finger against his temple. But let us not run ahead of ourselves. Tell me of this solicitor, Pemberton. How long has he handled the family's affairs? Since old man Rossiter's day, apparently. 30-odd years, near enough. Poirot's eyes sharpened. 30 years, he said again, and this time there was something almost triumphant in his voice. Chief Inspector, I begin to think that everyone in this unhappy family has been circling the same date, the same year, for 30 years, without one of them troubling to look directly at it. I should like very much to speak with Monsieur Pemberton, and I should like, even more, to see the coroner's file from 1926. Can it be sent for? I'll have someone wire the county archive first thing tomorrow. Japp rubbed his eyes. Poirot, if this thing really does go back 30 years, we could be looking at half of London as a suspect. People that age, friends of the family, old servants, God knows who else. No, mon ami. Poirot rose, buttoning his coat with brisk, precise movements, though a small wince crossed his face as he straightened fully. The day had been a long one, and his back had not forgiven him for kneeling beside Evelyn Rossiter's body that morning. Not half of London. A murderer, with a memory 30 years long and a grievance sharp enough to survive it, is not a common thing. He, or she, is someone who was there, in 1926, close enough to know exactly how Margaret Rossiter died, and patient enough to wait until the perfect method presented itself again. That is not half of London, Chief Inspector. That is a very small number of people indeed, and I intend to find every one of them before the week is out. A warning in the tea. The wire from the county archive arrived 2 days later, and with it a slim brown folder that Japp brought personally to Poirot's flat, setting it on the small table beside the fire with the air of a man delivering something he was not entirely certain he wanted to touch. "Coroner's report, 1926, Japp said, dropping into the chair opposite. "Makes for odd reading. There was a witness at the inquest, a young governess, employed by the family at the time, name of Alice Merrow. She testified that Mrs. Rossiter kept a small private menagerie in the conservatory, birds mostly, and a pair of grass snakes she'd brought back from a trip to India, quite harmless apparently, kept for show. Governess said the mistress was found dead beside the snake enclosure one morning, bitten, though the snakes themselves were perfectly docile creatures and had never bitten anyone before or since. And the verdict was misadventure, Poirot said, half to himself, leafing through the yellowed pages. A harmless snake that had never bitten anyone suddenly bites and kills its owner, and the coroner is satisfied to call this an accident. Chief Inspector, I begin to admire our murderer's consistency, if nothing else. 30 years, and still the same trick. A snake that is not truly guilty, blamed for a death someone else designed. There's more, Japp said. This governess, Alice Merrow, she left the family's employ within a month of the inquest. No reference given, according to the file. Chap doing the digging for us found record of her marrying, a year later, a solicitor's clerk name of... Japp paused for effect, and Poirot, who did not care for theatrics even in his friend, nonetheless leaned forward slightly. Name of Pemberton. Young Mr. Pemberton, who went on, in time, to inherit his own father's practice, and who has handled the Rossiter family's legal affairs, Poirot, for the better part of 30 years. Poirot's hand, holding the coroner's file, went very still. The solicitor, he murmured, married to the governess who was present when Margaret Rossiter died. Mon Dieu. Chief Inspector, I think we must speak with Monsieur Pemberton a great deal more thoroughly than we have done. He had barely finished the sentence when the telephone in the hallway began to ring, sharp and insistent in the quiet flat. Poirot rose to answer it himself, and Japp, watching his friend's face change as he listened, was on his feet before Poirot had replaced the receiver. That was Hargreaves. "The butler," Poirot said, and his voice, though controlled, carried an urgency Japp had rarely heard in it. "Mon ami, we must go to Carrington Square at once. Susan Fenwick, the maid, she has been taken ill. Hargreaves says she collapsed not an hour ago after drinking her afternoon tea, and the doctor fears poison." They found Susan Fenwick in her small room above the kitchens, white as the pillow beneath her head. A doctor bent over her with a stethoscope, while Hargreaves hovered by the door, wringing his hands with the particular helplessness of a man whose whole life has been ordered around knowing exactly what to do, and who has now been confronted with a situation that fits none of his training. "She'll live, I think," the doctor said, without looking up. Whatever it was, the dose was small, or she brought most of it up before we arrived, but it was no natural illness, Monsieur Poirot. I'd stake my career on it. "The tea," Poirot said. "Where is the cup?" "Taken away and washed, I'm afraid, before anyone thought there was anything wrong with it," Hargreaves said miserably. "Mary took it down to the scullery straight off. It being habit, sir, you understand. None of us thought. No matter." Poirot's eyes moved around the small, plain room. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window overlooking the mews, and on the little table beside the bed, a small tin box, its lid slightly ajar. He crossed to it and looked inside without touching it, a handful of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them, folded small, a single sheet of notepaper. "Chief Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "I think you had better look at this." Japp came to his shoulder and read, over Poirot's careful unfolding of the paper, a few lines written in a hand both elegant and slightly unsteady, as though the writer's feelings had outrun their penmanship. I know what you saw that night in 1926, and I know what your silence has cost you all these years. I am prepared to make it worth your while at last, if you will keep silent a little longer still, speak of it to no one, least of all to him." "E.R., E.R.," Japp said slowly. "Evelyn Rossiter." "Or," Poirot said, very softly, "someone who wished us to believe it was Evelyn Rossiter." He straightened, his eyes moving to the unconscious girl on the bed. "Susan Fenwick was in this house in 1926, Chief Inspector." "No, she is far too young. She cannot have been more than a child, if that. But someone in this house believes she saw something, or knows something, that makes her dangerous. And that person has just tried to silence her. You think this note's a fake?" "I think," Poirot said, folding it carefully into his own pocket, "that Evelyn Rossiter has been dead for 4 days, Chief Inspector, and cannot have written a note to Susan Fenwick either yesterday or today. Which means someone in this house is still very much alive, still very much afraid, and has just made the first true mistake of this entire affair." He looked toward the window, where the grey afternoon light was already beginning to fade toward evening. "A murderer who is frightened, mon ami, is a murderer who moves too quickly. I think we are, at last, close to the end of this." The drawing room. By 7 o'clock that evening, the drawing room at Carrington Square had been arranged precisely as Poirot required. Chairs set in a loose half-circle before the cold fireplace, the curtains drawn against the dark, a single lamp lit low so that faces might be seen, but not too clearly seen, which was, Poirot privately reflected, exactly how most people preferred to be looked at when they were afraid. Gerald Rossiter arrived first, still faintly flushed from an afternoon he did not trouble to explain, and took the chair nearest the door as though he might have use for it later. Charles Wembley came next, pale and composed, his grief now settled into something quieter and more watchful. Madame Rossiter entered last of the family, moving with the deliberate slowness of a woman who wished it known that she attended this gathering under protest. And in a chair, a little apart from the others, still wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the room, sat Susan Fenwick, recovered enough to sit up, though her hands trembled faintly in her lap. Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, arrived last of all, a neat, grey little man with the permanently apologetic manner of one who has spent his career being the bearer of other people's bad news, and who did not, tonight, look at all pleased to have been asked to attend. "I confess, I don't see what purpose this serves," Pemberton said, seating himself with visible reluctance. "I have already given the police a full account of the will, Monsieur Poirot." "I fail to see what more." "You will indulge an old man's methods, monsieur," Poirot said pleasantly, "for a few minutes only, and then we shall none of us need trouble one another again." He stood before the cold fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, and let his eyes move, slowly and without hurry, across every face in the room. "I wish to tell you a story. It is a story that begins not 4 days ago, with the death of Miss Evelyn Rossiter, but 30 years ago, with the death of her mother, Margaret Rossiter, a death that was called misadventure, and was not." A small, sharp silence fell over the room. Madame Rossiter's hands tightened in her lap. Pemberton's face had gone the particular grey of a man who has just heard a door open that he believed permanently locked. "In 1926, Poirot continued, a young governess named Alice Merrow was present in this house when her mistress died of a snake bite that should not, by any reasonable account, have occurred. She left her position within the month, and within the year she married a young solicitor's clerk, just beginning his career. That clerk, ladies and gentlemen, was Mr. Pemberton, who sits among us now." "This is monstrous," Pemberton said, his voice rising, though it cracked slightly on the word. "My wife has been dead these 10 years, Monsieur Poirot." "I fail to see what bearing." "Your wife," Poirot said gently, "told you, I think, before she died, precisely what she witnessed that night 30 years ago, and I think you have carried that knowledge, and the grievance that grew from it, for a very long time indeed. Tell me, monsieur, what did Alice Merrow see on the night Margaret Rossiter died?" Pemberton's mouth worked silently for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She saw She told me years later, when she was dying herself and past caring what secrets she kept, she saw Madame Rossiter standing over the snake enclosure, with Margaret's own hand held fast in hers, guiding it toward the creature. She saw it and said nothing, because she was young and frightened, and had nowhere else to go, and because Madame Rossiter told her plainly that no one would ever believe a governess's word over a lady's. Every eye in the room turned toward Madame Rossiter, who sat very straight in her chair, her face as composed as a woman discussing the weather. "An old governess's dying fancy," she said coldly. "I hardly think, Monsieur Poirot, that you intend to build a case for murder on the deathbed ramblings of a woman none of us can now question." "No, madame," Poirot agreed. "I do not intend to build my case on Alice Merrow's word alone. I intend to build it on this." He drew from his pocket the note found in Susan Fenwick's room and held it up so that all might see it. A note, written to appear as though it came from Evelyn Rossiter herself, though Evelyn had already been dead some hours when it was delivered. A note designed to frighten a young maid into silence. A maid who, I think, saw something on the night of Evelyn's death that she did not fully understand until this afternoon's events made its importance suddenly, terribly clear. He turned toward Susan, whose face had gone very pale beneath the lamplight. "Mademoiselle Fenwick, I think you told me you were abed by 11 o'clock on the night your mistress died. But servants do not always sleep as soundly as they claim, and windows in a house such as this look out, do they not, onto other windows? Tell us, and you need not be afraid now, for I promise you the truth will protect you far better than silence has done. What did you see?" Susan's hands twisted the shawl in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice shook but did not waver. "I woke near midnight, sir, same as I told you, on account of the wind. And I looked out my window, the way one does when one can't sleep, and I saw a light in Madame Rossiter's sitting room, and a shadow crossing it, going toward the stairs, sir, toward Miss Evelyn's floor, not away from it. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Madame often can't sleep either, but this afternoon, when that note came for me, threatening me so, I understood all at once what I'd seen, and I was so frightened I couldn't eat my luncheon properly, and then the tea came and—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "And someone in this house," Poirot said quietly, "realized that you had, at last, understood the significance of what you saw, and moved very quickly to silence you before you could speak of it to anyone. That, mesdames et messieurs, was the first true mistake of this entire affair. A murderer who has waited 30 years for their revenge does not, as a rule, grow careless. But a murderer who is suddenly, unexpectedly frightened, that is a different matter altogether." Madame Rossiter rose from her chair, her face still composed, but her eyes, Poirot noted, had taken on the fixed, glassy brightness of a woman calculating her last remaining options. "You have built a very pretty story, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "out of a dying woman's fancy and a frightened girl's imagination. I do not think it will impress a jury half so much as it appears to impress you." "Perhaps not, madame," Poirot said, and something in his tone had grown very quiet, very final. "Which is why I have saved the truest evidence for last. Chief Inspector, if you would." Japp, who had been standing unobtrusively near the door throughout, stepped forward and produced, from beneath his coat, a small object wrapped in a plain white cloth, which he set upon the table beside the lamp and unwrapped with careful hands. It was a small glass vial, empty now, but for a faint residue crusted along its inner rim. "Found in the ash bin behind the scullery not 2 hours ago," Japp said grimly, "along with a syringe of the sort used by veterinary surgeons for the milking of snake venom. Someone in this house, Poirot tells me, has a private income and rather too much free time, and made a study, some years back, of a rather specialized and unpleasant branch of toxicology." The silence that followed was very long and very complete, and it was Madame Rossiter herself who finally broke it, not with a denial, but with something that was almost, in its cold way, relief. "The weight of an old hurt. Sit down, Monsieur Poirot. Madame Rossiter said, and her voice had changed, the brittle coldness gone out of it, replaced by something older and wearier. The voice, perhaps, of the woman she might have been 30 years ago, before whatever had happened to her had hardened into what she had since become. You have earned the right to hear it properly, I suppose, rather than have it dragged out of me by a policeman's questions. She did not sit herself, but stood by the cold fireplace, one hand resting upon the mantel as though she needed its support, and looked not at Poirot, but at some point beyond him, in the middle distance, where perhaps the past was easier to see than the present. "Margaret Rossiter," she began, "was my husband's brother's wife, and I hated her within a month of meeting her, though it took me a good deal longer to admit as much even to myself. She was everything I was not, warm, careless, adored by everyone who met her, and married to a man who worshipped the ground she walked on. My own husband, her brother-in-law, was a colder sort of man, and did not trouble to hide from me that he considered his brother's marriage the happier one." Her fingers tightened on the mantel. "I do not offer that as an excuse, Monsieur Poirot. I offer it only as an explanation, which is not the same thing, whatever people wish to believe." "You had access to her private menagerie," Poirot said quietly. "The snakes she kept for show. I had access to a great many things in that house, in those years. It was not difficult to learn that the grass snakes were entirely harmless, a fact Margaret was rather proud of, actually, that her pretty creatures had never harmed a soul. It amused me, in a bitter sort of way, to think how easily her pride might be turned against her. I had, by then, made something of a study of certain toxins. A foolish, idle interest at first, the sort of thing a bored woman takes up to fill her empty afternoons, until it became something rather less idle." She paused. "I will not describe to you exactly how it was done. I think you have very likely worked it out already, Monsieur Poirot, and I find I have very little appetite left for confessing details to a room full of frightened faces. You applied venom, milked from a genuinely venomous creature, obtained through less respectable channels than Margaret's own harmless pets, to a small instrument fashioned to resemble Fangs," Poirot said, without emotion, as though reciting a fact from a textbook rather than describing a murder. "You guided her hand, as the governess witnessed, toward the enclosure, and in the confusion of the moment, delivered the fatal wound yourself, allowing the harmless snakes to bear the blame that was never truly theirs." "Yes," Madame Rossiter said simply. "That is very nearly it. I will only add, since you have been so thorough in every other particular, that I did not enjoy it, Monsieur Poirot, whatever you may think of me. I have never enjoyed any of it. I have only found myself, at each turn, unable to stop. And Evelyn?" This from Charles Wembley, who had risen halfway from his chair, his face white with a horror that had not fully caught up to what he was hearing. "Why, Evelyn? She never did you any harm. She loved you. She trusted you. She was going to sell this house." Madame Rossiter's voice, for the first time, cracked slightly. "After her marriage, she told me herself, not 3 weeks ago, quite kindly, quite gently, as she told me everything, that she and Mr. Wembley intended to take a house of their own once they were married, and that she hoped I would not mind terribly moving to smaller rooms, somewhere more suited to a woman living alone." "Smaller rooms?" She laughed, a short, unhappy sound with no real humor in it. "I have lived in this house for 30 years, Monsieur Poirot. I buried my husband from this house. I am not a young woman, to be moved about like a piece of furniture that no longer suits the room." "And so you decided," Poirot said, "that if you could not keep the house, you would at least ensure that the fortune that came with it passed to someone who might, in time, be more easily managed than a headstrong young woman about to marry and set up her own household." "Gerald has always done as I asked," Madame Rossiter said, and there was something almost tender in the way her eyes moved, briefly, toward her nephew, who sat frozen in his chair, staring at her as though he had never truly seen her before this moment. "He is weak, and he is fond of me, and he does not ask difficult questions. I did not wish him harmed by any of this, Monsieur Poirot. I want that understood, at least. Whatever else I have done, I never intended that Gerald should suffer for it. The necklace, Poirot said. That was your own touch, I think. A small cruelty, or a small poetry, depending upon how one wishes to view it. A gift fashioned in the shape of the very creature that was blamed, 30 years ago, for a crime it did not commit. I had it made 2 years ago, Madame Rossiter admitted, from a jeweller in Hatton Garden who asks no questions of his customers so long as they pay in cash. I do not know why I had it made. Precisely, I told myself, at the time, that it was only a fancy, a private joke, that no one else would ever understand. It was not until Evelyn told me of her plans to sell the house that I understood I had been preparing, without quite admitting it to myself, for a day I had always known, somewhere beneath the surface of my mind, might come again. And the note left for Susan, Poirot said, the poison in her tea. Those were not the actions of a woman preparing calmly, madame. Those were the actions of a woman who had, at last, grown afraid. Yes, Madame Rossiter said, very quietly. I was afraid. I am still afraid, Monsieur Poirot, though I find, now that it is over, that the fear has a different quality than I expected. I always imagined that if I were caught, the fear would be of the gallows or of prison. Instead, I find myself only tired. Tired in a way I do not think sleep will ever entirely cure. There was a long silence in the drawing-room, broken only by the small, ordinary sound of the fire settling in the grate, and Poirot, watching the old woman's face in the low lamplight, felt, not for the first time in a career that had shown him a great deal of human wickedness, a curious mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that he had never fully learned to separate from one another, however many years he practiced his peculiar profession. "Chief Inspector," he said quietly, "I think you had better do your duty." It was past 10 o'clock when Poirot finally left Carrington Square, the fog thicker now than it had been that morning, wrapping the black railings and pale house fronts in a grey silence that seemed, somehow, appropriate to the evening's business. Japp walked with him as far as the corner, where a taxi waited. 30 years, Japp said, shaking his head. 30 years of hate, kept warm all that time, waiting for its moment. Makes a man wonder what's sitting quiet in half the houses in London, Poirot, just waiting for the right night to come along. That, mon ami, is a thought I do not recommend dwelling upon for too long, or you will never sleep soundly again, Poirot said, though there was less lightness in the remark than he intended, and Japp, glancing sideways at his friend, noticed that the old detective looked, for once, every one of his years, his shoulders a little bowed, his step a little slower than it had been that morning, as though the case had cost him something that had nothing to do with logic or little grey cells. "You did well. All the same," Japp said gruffly, which was, from Japp, as close to warm praise as Poirot had ever learned to expect. "I did what was necessary," Poirot said. "I do not know, mon ami, that I would call it doing well. A young woman is dead. Her mother was dead 30 years before her. And the woman responsible was not a monster in any way that makes the world simpler to understand. She was only a woman who let one small, bitter hurt grow in the dark for 30 years, unspoken, unexamined, until it had grown large enough to swallow everything around it. That is not a triumph, Chief Inspector. That is only a very sad ending to a very sad story, and I confess I find myself, tonight, rather less pleased with my own cleverness than I generally am." He climbed into the waiting taxi and paused, his hand on the door, to look back once at the pale front of the house, its windows now lit from within by the harsher light of policemen going about their business. "Get some sleep, Poirot," Japp said. "You've earned it." "Perhaps," Poirot said. "I shall, though I think, tonight, I shall dream not of Mademoiselle Evelyn Rossiter, nor of her mother before her, but of all the small, quiet hurts sitting in all the houses of this city, waiting, as Madame Rossiter's hurt waited, for their own dark hour to arrive. It is a sobering thought, mon ami, for an old man to carry home to an empty flat. But it is, I think, the truest lesson this case has to teach, that murder is very rarely born in a single night. It is born, most often, over years, in silence, in the small rooms where no one thinks to look. The taxi pulled away into the fog, and Chief Inspector Japp stood alone on the corner for a long moment, watching its lights disappear, before he turned up his collar against the cold and walked back toward the house, and the long, tired work of finishing what Hercule Poirot had begun.